country cooking menus, I think, vary from region to region. I grew up in Western Maryland, and country cooking there was very different than here in Southeastern North Carolina. In Western Maryland, one of my favorite country foods was fries with brown gravy, which is not really to be found here in North Carolina, at least not where I live. But I have spent most of my adult life in North Carolina, and I learned to cook in North Carolina. So now country cooking to me is something entirely different. So, first up on the menu is chicken and pastry. And depending on where you live, you might know this as chicken and dumplings. To make this, I'm first just cooking a whole chicken. Now, you could do this in the Instant Pot, a crock pot. I'm just doing it on the stove today because I have the time to let it cook on the stove. And also, I really like the quality of the broth for something like chicken and pastry when it's made on the stove. So, I just put the chicken in there and I filled it up with enough water to mostly cover the chicken, and I let it cook for about 2 to 3 hours. And I'm taking the chicken out to cool off enough so I can pick it. And that broth is vital to this recipe. So I'm just setting that aside for a few minutes. And in the meantime, I am making the pastry or dumplings. My husband is Southern and he grew up eating food like this, and he said he grew up calling this chicken and dumplings. I learned it as chicken and pastry, but I've also heard it called chicken pastry, chicken slick, all sorts of different names, but the sentiment is the same. It's just a simple combination of flour, butter, milk, and salt. Now, I have been using mostly fresh milled flour in my recipes, but for this, I really wanted that classic flavor and texture, so I'm using regular all-purpose flour. But you could definitely make this with fresh milled flour. I just published an article about how to convert all-purpose flour to fresh milled flour for any recipe. So if you're interested in that, you can check it out there. I'll leave a link in the description box. So once you get the ingredients combined, you just mix them together, and then you really don't want to work it too much. So I needed this, I'd say somewhere between 10 and 15 times just to bring the ingredients together. And then I let it rest on the counter while I pick the chicken. And that just lets that gluten relax a little bit so it's easier to roll in a few minutes. One of the things I really appreciate about country cooking and Southern cooking is that the ingredients are always simple and the process is simple. It's usually a combination of flour, butter, and some sort of protein. And I just mentioned a few weeks ago in my old-fashioned frugality video that when you are cooking from scratch, that is key. Keeping simple ingredients on hand and keeping the process really simple too. Everything tastes good with a little butter, salt, and pepper. It doesn't have to be complicated. So now that the chicken is picked, I am boiling about half of that broth, and now I'm rolling out the dough. So this is a pretty sticky dough. So if you make this, I would anticipate having to generously flour your counter and the top of the dough, but just roll it out to about a 1/4 inch thickness. And I'm using a pizza cutter just to cut it in little rectangles. You can make it thinner, you can make the rectangles longer. It's really up to you. You kind of can't go wrong here. In my cast iron Dutch oven, I put about half of the chicken broth and I strained it. And I like to use about half because you can always add more, but I don't really like this to be soupy. It really has like a creamy gravy-like texture. And I add that pastry in just one at a time or a couple at a time just to prevent them from sticking together. And once they're all in there, I'm bringing it to a boil and just seasoning it really simply with some salt, pepper, and sage. This is actually very good with poultry seasoning if you have it, but I did not have any on hand. But you can season it however you like. But again, in the spirit of country and Southern cooking, just keep it really simple and let those flavors of the pastry and the chicken shine. Once the pastry was cooked, I then just added back in some of the chicken. I think I used about half to maybe 3/4 of the chicken. I tend to like a little more pastry than chicken in my chicken and pastry, but you can add as much or as little as you prefer. Next up on the menu, I am making sourdough biscuits with sausage gravy, which is my favorite Southern meal ever. So for these biscuits, I am first putting some butter in the freezer so it is nice and cold. And this calls for buttermilk, but I almost never have buttermilk on hand. And when I do, I never get through it fast enough. So in place of buttermilk, I am mixing together 1 cup of milk and a tablespoon of vinegar, and that works as a great substitute for buttermilk. This is a pretty classic biscuit recipe. The only real difference is I'm adding in sourdough discard. Now, you don't have to use sourdough discard for these. You can make any biscuit recipe, but I really like to add sourdough discard into recipes because I often have some left over from my feedings. A common question I get is, why do you need to put discard in something like a biscuit recipe? That recipe's already been perfected, which is true, but if you already have discard on hand, you might as well just toss it into something and it adds a little bit of extra flavor. Now, for these biscuits, I shredded the butter on a box grater and then I put it back into the freezer so it stays nice and cold. And I'm letting it stay in the freezer while I get the rest of the biscuit dough going and while I am preheating the oven to 400 degrees Fahrenheit. For a really long time, I shied away from making biscuits because the cold butter part freaked me out. I don't know why, it just did. It seemed like it was too complicated and the butter would always get warm and melt. But if you freeze it, shred it, and put it back in the freezer, it works really well. You can see here, it might be a little hard to see on camera, that milk is a little bit thicker and it almost has sort of like a curdling effect with it, which adds as that buttermilk substitute. So that's kind of cool. And now I'm just adding in that sourdough discard, the milk, and stirring it with a Danish dough whisk just until it comes together. I find that it's almost always easiest though at the end to use my hands to make sure there are no dry ingredients left. And now I am just flouring the counter and turning that dough out onto the counter. For biscuits, you really don't want any gluten development, at least not in my experience and for my taste. So I'm just turning it out, patting it into a pretty thick rectangle. I'd say about an inch thick. You could even do thicker if you really wanted like a nice tall biscuit. And I'm using a cup to cut the biscuits, but you could definitely use a biscuit cutter or a cookie cutter. So this made about 8 biscuits. It really depends on how thin or how thick you press out that dough. And these biscuits kind of underscore the simplicity of country cooking. There is no kneading. You don't have to worry about gluten development. There's no yeast. There's no rise, bulk fermentation. It's just a simple combination of ingredients that you cut into biscuit shapes and bake. I prefer to bake my biscuits in a cast iron skillet. So this is a 13 1/4 inch cast iron skillet just for reference. And I like doing this because it creates a bit of a crispier golden bottom on the biscuits, but also because it's that round shape, it kind of holds them together and they stay like a little soft on the edges and they're really good that way. Okay, we need to talk about sausage gravy. I am running into an issue where every restaurant here in southeastern North Carolina has a really weird sausage gravy. They are doing something strange in the restaurants and adding all sorts of creative ingredients. The last place I went to, it had a bunch of cheese in it and some like sort of tomato base. That is not a sausage gravy. It's something else. It wasn't bad. It just wasn't sausage gravy. Bless your heart. Sausage gravy is just sausage, some fat, flour, and milk. So I just browned some country sausage, took it out and put it on a plate. And then I took some beef tallow and combined it with about a 1/4 cup of flour. And once that flour cooked for about a minute or so, I added in, I'd say about 3 cups of milk. And then you just stir it or whisk it until it thickens. And once it thickened, I added the sausage back in. Now, I've made this before without taking the sausage out, and it worked just fine, but I actually think this method worked a little bit better. It was easier to get a smoother consistency. And then I just seasoned this with a little bit of salt and a lot of black pepper because I love a lot of black pepper in sausage gravy. And these biscuits were done just in time, and they are beautiful. These biscuits were really hot when I was holding it, so I used a knife to cut it because it was kind of burning my fingers, but they actually just pull apart like a dream. They are so good and so flaky, and then piled high with some homemade sausage gravy. This is truly one of my all-time favorite meals. And over the last few years, I've discovered that if I want to have a really good classic sausage gravy and biscuits, I just have to make it at home. Okay, last up on the country cooking menu is chicken fried steak with mashed potatoes. I made the mashed potatoes the day before. Really, I think mashed potatoes are made best the day of. If you look around Thanksgiving, for example, all the tips and tricks, they always say make the mashed potatoes on Thanksgiving Day because they do taste better that way. But if I want to have chicken fried steak and mashed potatoes on a Tuesday night, I'm just going to have to make those mashed potatoes Monday afternoon. It's the only way it will work out. So when I chop up the potatoes, what I do first is I put them in a pot of cold water, and then I bring that pot of water with the potatoes in it to a boil. That helps the potato cook more evenly. So sometimes when you boil potatoes, the outside cooks first and it starts to crumble away. So doing it this way helps it cook evenly and prevents that crumbling from happening. Now, I have mashed many a batch of mashed potatoes with a regular old hand masher, but I found over the years that the quality and the consistency is better if I use my stand mixer. I read years ago that it's because the stand mixer is more efficient at mashing them, so it doesn't break down the starch as much. And it's definitely just easier to do it this way. So I put those in the fridge overnight, and now it is the next night, and I am making some chicken fried steak. So to make this, you will need cube steak, and usually chicken fried steak is pretty thin. So I am putting this between two pieces of parchment paper and pounding it a little bit thinner. This is for a few reasons. It helps tenderize it. That cut of meat sometimes can be a little tough, but it also makes it a little bit thinner and more even, so it's easier to cook in hot oil. Now, lately, I've actually done a lot of breaded and fried things on YouTube, so you've probably seen me do this a couple of times, but it is a little bit different because I'm doing a double breading. So first, I'm mixing together some milk and an egg in one dish, and then in the other dish, I'm mixing flour and some cornstarch. I really wouldn't recommend the cornstarch. I read somewhere that it makes it crispier. Every time I do it, I don't like it. I don't know why I did it this time, so I would just stick with regular old flour. So for the double coating or double breading, I'm first just taking a piece of cube steak and putting it in the flour or dredging it through the flour. Then I'm dipping it in the milk and egg mixture. And then I'm putting it right back into that flour mixture. Now, for something like chicken fried steak, one thing that can help it fry up really nicely is to let it rest for a little bit. So after coating it, I'm putting it on a tray and just letting it sit there and resting for about 10 minutes or so, however long it takes me to heat up the oil. So I'm using beef tallow. I've really been enjoying cooking with beef tallow lately. So my husband has been making delicious fries with it, and then he strains it. So this is probably our third round at using this tallow, which is kind of cool that we're able to get so much use out of it. So I'm bringing that tallow to about 365 degrees or so. So that way, when I put that meat in there and the temperature drops, it still doesn't go below 350. Anytime you fry, you really want that temperature to be around 350, 360. A mistake that I made all the time when I was first learning to cook, especially learning to cook Southern food, is I never had the oil hot enough, which will make a really soggy piece of fried food, which is not delicious. So make sure it's nice and hot. Now, of course, it wouldn't be chicken fried steak without gravy, so I'm making the same type of gravy as I did before, but without the sausage. This time I'm just using some butter, flour, and milk with a lot of pepper, and then serving this up with those reheated mashed potatoes and a big spoonful of gravy, and this was delicious. At its core, country and Southern cooking is so simple. And one of the other things I really love about it is that it uses all parts. You cook the whole chicken, you use the bones, you use the fat for gravy. Nothing goes to waste. And I really, really appreciate that about country cooking. These meals were all so delicious and simple and easy to make. And I think out of about maybe 120 YouTube videos I've made now, this is the one my husband was the most excited about. If you found this video helpful, don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button. And if you want to stay in the know with all of the Moon and Magnolia happenings, join the email list. When you sign up, I will send you links to all of my recipes, tutorials, videos, and more. Thank you so much for stopping by today, and I'll see you again next time.